it is true that his obsession with these pet projects is ridiculous, right? I mean, you watch what we were just watching there, and it's almost laughable.
You can't take credit for that when Joe Biden's
sure we
policy.
Can. I just did.
Joe Biden's policies. Yeah, you can, but you'd be lying because Joe Biden's policies contributed to the.
Who's the president?
Joe
you blame him for everything. You can't give him a little credit.
Republicans are not addressing it. What they're trying to do is they're trying to say this is great, that is great, right? Affordability is a hoax. Okay, still says that. You can't tell people how to feel.
Good evening, I'm Abby Phillip.
Guys, recently on Abby Phillip's show, MAGA pundit Scott Jennings walked into a trap he did not see coming. He tried defending Trump's ballroom and helipad obsession while the national debt hit $40 trillion. And working class Americans are feeling the heat in their wallets. Abby and the progressives on the panel pressed this MAGA defender so hard that his answers started falling apart. Let's see what exactly happened during this heated show, and I'll talk about it as we go.
In New York, tonight, the United States has dug itself into a deep financial hole, and Donald Trump is insisting on keeping on digging. The national debt hit a record of $40 trillion. That is a milestone that we will have that will have significant consequences for us, for Americans, for decades to come. And while the nation has carried a significant amount of debt for a very long time, recent trends have economists sounding the alarm. The size of the debt has grown considerably over the last decade. Interest payments are ballooning. The federal government spending is continuing to outpace the revenue that it collects to pay for its obligations, which now include a war in Iran, sweeping tax cuts enacted by Republicans in 2025. Just this year, the United States is now on track to borrow more than $2 trillion, with over $1 trillion in the last 5 months alone. Now, remember back in 2016 when Donald Trump promised to eliminate the U.S. debt by the end of his second term? Well, today, his priorities appear elsewhere. Trump spent more than half an hour giving members of the press an impromptu tour of his construction projects. The president has been obsessed with his construction projects, Dan, and it is almost comical at this point, but the contrast between that focus and the real reality of this ballooning debt and the abandoned promise, not just to eliminate the debt, which nobody thought would ever happen, but even just a year ago, they were talking about cutting government spending. Nobody's talking about that anymore.
Right. Look, it is true that his obsession with these pet projects is ridiculous, right? I mean, you watch what we were just watching there, and it's almost laughable. But now let's bring it back to the debt, right? The amount we're talking about there is not substantial enough to be directly connected to the debt. You can say message-wise, right, it's the wrong message to send. But when you're talking about the debt, we really got to talk about the Iran war, right? That's a huge, huge number that continues. You could even talk to some degree about the tariffs, right? The fact that we had to give back $166 billion. Still.
Well, I mean, that was money that didn't belong to the government in the first place.
Well, look,
but it is about focus. It's also about, it's not about message. It's also about focus. It's also about what are his
clearly
priorities.
not, it's not a priority for him.
Right?
There's no doubt it's not a priority for him. But let's also recognize that it's true that whoever the party is who's not in power ends up focusing on the debt, right? I mean, when a president and an administration is in power, they don't want to talk about the debt as much. They want to borrow. The people on the outside want to talk about the debt. That happens with both sides. With that said, you're right. He said in 2016 that they were going to be able to end the debt. It hasn't happened. Think about what happened with Doge, right? That was supposed to save us, trillions of dollars, right? And maybe it saved $200 billion, and the cuts were not very smart. So there's a lot of criticism to be had, but let's just make sure that we're focusing it on the right place when it comes to what are the actual and most important causes of the ballooning.
I totally agree. I mean, I just remember a year ago, many people, including you and others at this table, would argue to me that what Doge was doing was so important. That they were finding, government contracts worth $30 million, and it was chipping away at our national debt. That wasn't true. But now we're on a spending spree for the president's vanity projects.
I never said they were chipping away at the national debt. I've consistently said out here and everywhere else that the national debt will only be solved when both parties get serious about entitlement reform. That's number one. Number two, Doge did important work, which has shined light on things that were patently ridiculous. Number three, the federal government is smaller today than it has been since the 1960s, and as a portion of GDP, it's smaller probably since the turn of the last century. The $40 trillion debt is a bipartisan disgrace, but Dan is exactly right. To connect it to the helipad, which is being paid for by Sikorsky, not by tax dollars, is patently
Well, you
ridiculous.
know it's not just
but
the
it could
helipad,
be, it
it's
could be
also
solved,
the
but
ballroom.
it will take both parties.
You know that it's also the ballroom, which he asked for $1 billion from taxpayers for.
Yeah.
And it's also, to Dan's point, the,
You wanna do the
war.
math? What's a billion out of 40 trillion?
There's a war
It's
in
the war,
Iran
and it's the
that
one
is
big, beautiful
costing a lot
bill.
of money.
The one big beautiful bill that blew a hole in the deficit and created more debt for the federal government. The federal debt has increased $4 trillion since Donald Trump came in office. That's an enormous amount in a very short amount of time. I hope, if nothing else, that this debacle proves once and for all, or debunks the myth that Republicans are good for the economy.
Guys, here's where the story gets wild. Trump spent more than half an hour giving reporters a personal tour of his construction site at the White House, and the footage gets pretty bizarre. He's out there calling the stone flawless granite. Then at one point he starts talking about grass like it has a human existence. Meanwhile, the national debt has crossed $40 trillion. That is a historic milestone, but an alarming one. And honestly, it should make anybody in Washington stop and pay attention. The federal government is still running enormous annual deficits. Interest costs are already consuming an extraordinary amount of money. So Abby Phillip brings up the contradiction to the panel. Jennings immediately tries to separate the helipad from the broader ballroom controversy. But Phillip's point was bigger than the helipad. She brought the conversation back to the ballroom. Senate Republicans had proposed $1 billion in federal funding for security-related upgrades, including at the White House and ballroom site. Trump, meanwhile, has repeatedly said the ballroom itself would be privately funded, and that's where the argument gets uncomfortable. Jennings can defend the helipad funding all day long, but that doesn't answer the larger question. How much public money is ultimately connected to this project? Later reporting made the controversy even worse for MAGA defenders. A contractor estimate put the ballroom project at around $600 million. More than half of that could come from taxpayers. The Trump administration, meanwhile, has continued describing the project as privately funded. Then Keith Boykin brought up another number that really stings. The national debt has increased by roughly $4 trillion since Trump returned to office. The exact figure is close to $4 trillion, and that's an enormous increase in a very short period. Jennings tried to steady the ship by calling the debt a bipartisan disgrace. But here's the question. If the debt is a bipartisan disgrace, why does fiscal urgency suddenly disappear when the spending involves something Trump personally wants? You can't spend years telling Americans that Washington wastes too much money, then the moment Trump steps into the White House, you follow the same playbook and arguably take it even further. If the ballroom is necessary, explain why. If the security spending is necessary, explain it. And if taxpayers really aren't footing the bill, show Americans exactly where every dollar is coming from. That's not an attack on Trump, it's accountability.
If you look at Donald Trump's record, he shows exactly the opposite. The debt is up, inflation is up, gas prices are up, unemployment.
Inflation's down, actually.
No, inflation is up, gas prices are up.
Inflation is down.
Inflation is up.
It's down.
It was 3% when Joe Biden took office.
Inflation is higher today than it was when Trump
That's
took
higher
office.
than when he took office.
To hear you two ignore the inflation rate during Biden versus
You just made a factual mistake.
What was the highest rate during Biden?
Inflation was 3%.
What was the highest rate during Biden?
I'm speaking right now. I said, and I'm correct, inflation was 3%.
There was no inflation during Biden. You heard it here on CNN. No inflation.
Hold on, Keith. Let me just settle this once and for all. We don't need to argue over things that are just facts.
Factually
okay?
wrong.
Inflation was very high under Biden, but when Donald Trump came into office, it was lower than it is
3%.
today.
It was 3%.
That's the
So
end
you
of
admit that it was
that is the
it
end
went
of
up
that.
under Biden,
Scott,
and it's
Scott,
lower now.
Why are you arguing over things
what are
that
you
don't need
talking
to be
about,
argued
Scott?
about? If the
You just love to
inflation rate
distract
when Donald Trump took office was lower than what it
Thank
is
you.
today, that is what Keith is talking about. That's not something to
For
argue
you
about.
to argue that inflation
let's
wasn't
move
a
on.
problem when he took office is
Scott is trying to
crazy.
distract from the fact that Donald Trump has been a failure for the economy.
Let's move on. Congressman, you're in Congress. Republicans have blamed Democrats for never wanting to address spending. Is that true?
So let me say this. I agree that the debt is a bipartisan problem. We both did it. We both have added to the debt. And both of us don't want to fix it. And the only way it's going to get fixed, and I've put forward a bill and a resolution to form a joint committee that would put a bill on the floor, because you have to put a bill on the floor for an up or down vote. Studies don't matter, which would raise revenue and do cuts. Both sides are going to have to do both. We're not getting out of this problem just by cuts, and we're not getting out of this problem just by raising revenue. It has to be both. And until someone decides that we're going to do both, it's not going to happen. Look, I'm a former emergency management director. We do proactive things. Congress doesn't do that. Congress does reactive things. And I'm really worried that as the de-dollarization continues and inflation gets worse, that it's going to take an emergency to get both parties to do it. And this is something that regular people in their regular day life, as they can't afford groceries and they can't afford their rent, aren't thinking about the debt. But this is something that's going to dramatically change Americans' lives if we wake up one day and have rapid inflation, and then we teeter on a recession depression as China tries to push more de-dollarization, and then we can't borrow anymore.
So President Trump earlier today had some comments about the economy, and he lamented that interest rates were too high because the economy is doing well in his view. Just listen to what he had to say.
When our country does well, interest rates should go down. I mean, every time I hear our country's doing well, I say, oh, it's too bad, because they lift up interest rates. They should drop interest rates because it means we have a strong country. And it's all based on credit, meaning good credit. And we have the best credit. And we'd pay off the debt very easily, very quickly.
Sometimes I wonder if the president understands how economics work and if he understands why interest rates are higher, well, which is not because, you know, they're trying to punish the American people for the economy doing well. It's in part to keep a lid on inflation.
Yeah, well, just to clarify his comments, when he's saying he wants things to go bad, that's kind of a reference to a phrase on Wall Street: bad news is good news and good news is bad news, because when there's slowing GDP growth or whatnot, typically that means you'll lower interest rates. So sometimes the market can have funny reactions to various reports. So obviously he's been very clear from the get-go that he would like to see interest rates decline rapidly. Look, you know, I'm just reminded of the last person to run on any sort of fiscal austerity or entitlement reform, which, when you look at the federal budget, about 70% is the interest on the debt and entitlements. The only person to acknowledge that was Mitt Romney, and he got crucified because he said essentially 47% of people wouldn't vote for him because they were getting more from the government than they were contributing. He obviously lost dramatically, and after that it became clear that you simply can't run and win a federal election on reforming the budget. But I will say, I mean, I think what Republicans are pushing and offering is sort of the Reaganomics and a pro-growth agenda, and at least unleashing capitalism, deregulating tax cuts that hopefully will grow the economy. And you juxtapose that with the DSA. But
how has that worked in the last, I mean, the president's been president for 18 months. They passed the tax cuts. They did that, right? GDP growth has slowed. Debt has increased. I'm not seeing the economics working.
Guys, here's the part that actually hits people where it hurts: their wallets. While critics argued about government spending and debt, millions of Americans weren't sitting around debating fiscal policy. They're trying to make a paycheck last until Friday. And honestly, ordinary people don't need a PhD in economics to know their money isn't going as far as it used to. You see it at the grocery store. A basic shopping trip can suddenly cost $100. You see it when the landlord raises the rent. You see it when an insurance renewal arrives. You stare at the number and wonder whether somebody accidentally added an extra zero. That's the economic reality people are living with. Then you turn on the TV and see the president celebrating a massive construction project. That's where the disconnect comes from. The argument isn't that a ballroom causes grocery prices to rise. It doesn't. The argument is that it shows how different Washington can feel from everyday America. People are being told to watch government spending. They're being told to accept difficult economic choices. They're being told that things are improving. But meanwhile, the president is surrounded by a construction project designed to project luxury and grandeur. That is a terrible visual if your political message is supposed to be about helping working Americans. And this is where MAGA commentators make another mistake. They assume every criticism is just another attack from liberals. No, sometimes people are simply looking at what they're seeing and asking whether it makes sense. Americans can support Trump and still think the ballroom is too expensive. They can oppose Trump and still acknowledge that the White House needs renovation. They can believe some economic indicators are improving and still say "My grocery bill is killing me." Both things can be true. During the panel, Jennings pointed to areas where he believed the economy was improving. He specifically mentioned prescription drug prices. Boykin pushed back. He argued that some of those savings came from policies established under Biden, especially Medicare's drug price negotiation provisions. Meanwhile, the person standing in the grocery aisle doesn't care which party gets credit. They want the total on the receipt to stop climbing. That's why the ballroom debate has traction. It's not because Americans think every White House renovation is evil. It's because people look at the granite, they look at the money, and then they look at their bank account.
I mean, I know you don't like it when I say the stock market is doing well, but there are certainly indicators that you can point to. The point I want to make, though,
the stock market actually arguably did better in the last year of the Biden administration than it did in the first year of Trump's.
Okay, well, I guess it depends how you look at the data. But I think when you look at the...
I'm just seriously asking.
When you look at the DSA, the alternative is the DSA, basically, Cato Institute just came out with a study that said if you implement all their policies, it's $200 trillion over the next 10 years. So you're looking at potentially a lot worse if you embrace
Trump's
the other side.
economic policy has been effectively tax cuts, which Republicans love, a war, tariffs, which were largely ruled to be unconstitutional, and he has ignored and dismissed the idea that costs are going up for the American people. So at what point is he going to address any of this, whether it is the debt or the rising costs, just the kind of fiscal instability that we are in as a country? It just seems like he doesn't really care. He's on the White House lawn talking about his helipad.
Well, look, I think he certainly, this goes back to image versus reality, right? I think he continues to make, there's a reason he's unpopular right now, right? He's wildly unpopular, despite the fact that the president is claiming that he's very popular. We all know the polls show he's got a low 30% now approval rating. And that's because of the things we're talking about. It's because he's not focusing on the issues that most Americans care about. He still has an opportunity to change that, right? It's not that hard a pivot, because if the president decides, I'm going to start focusing on these things, I'm going to start focusing on kitchen table issues, grocery prices, gas prices, and I'm going to seem like I really care about it. That could help, but I don't know that he's capable of doing that.
I think that focus on things that are going right is a great idea for a midterm. Case in point, on Friday, numerous outlets reported that government data shows prescription drugs prices are falling faster than they have in 60 years. That's the kind of thing.
Thanks in part to the Biden administration.
That's the kind of thing that if you were running for office and you were in office and you were getting the credit and the blame for everything that's happening, you would actually be talking about nonstop. That's an example of where, in a world that feels expensive, that's actually coming down. That's a good thing.
You can't take credit for that. When Joe Biden's
Sure we can. I just did.
Joe Biden's policies. Yeah, you can, but you'd be lying, because Joe Biden's policies contributed to the.
Who's the president? You blame him for everything. You can't give him a little credit.
Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act allowed Medicare to negotiate lower drug prices.
I thought we were memory holding Biden.
No,
you just did on inflation.
You choose selectively when you want to interrupt me, because you don't want to hear what I have to say, because
I don't actually. You're actually right.
Because I'm right.
But here's what I'll say. I'm astounded at the strategy of the Trump administration and Republicans right now. Because what they're doing, we tried. We tried to tell people the economy was great, everything's fine, Bidenomics, right? But people felt the economy was not doing well, and we lost, okay? Republicans are not addressing it. What they're trying to do is they're trying to say this is great, that is great, right? Affordability is a hoax, okay? He still says that. You can't tell people how to feel when they go home and they pay their bills and they feel they have no money to live, to be an American. And look, we're waiting. He's got 10 weeks before the midterm. We're waiting for him to do this.
Guys, just when you think the story couldn't get more complicated, here comes Iran. The economic argument doesn't stop at groceries, rent, and the national debt. The Trump administration is also dealing with the enormous financial consequences of war with Iran. Military operations cost real money. Aircraft, ships, missiles, intelligence, logistics, fuel, and every additional military commitment costs money. And when you're already carrying more than $40 trillion in debt, those costs costs hit even harder. Trump and his supporters can argue that confronting Iran was necessary for American security. It's not a legitimate debate. But if you're going to tell Americans that military action is necessary, you also owe them some answers. How much will it cost? How long will it last? What happens if the conflict expands? What does victory actually look like? And who's ultimately paying the bill? We're strong isn't a fiscal plan. We're winning doesn't tell taxpayers what the final price tag will be. And this is where MAGA pundits on TV need to answer some uncomfortable questions. There's another financial issue that makes the picture even messier: Trump's tariff program. After the Supreme Court ruled that certain tariffs imposed under the administration's emergency powers theory were unlawful, the federal government became obligated to refund roughly $166 billion to affected importers, excluding interest. By early August, more than $100 billion had reportedly already been paid out. That is an extraordinary amount of money, moving in the opposite direction from the administration's promise that tariffs would bring in revenue. So put the whole picture together. The national debt is above $40 trillion. Interest costs are enormous. Americans are complaining about the cost of everyday life. Billions are tied up in tariff refunds. And now there's a war with Iran, adding another layer of military spending and economic uncertainty. And then there's the disputed White House ballroom project, with questions about how much taxpayer money is ultimately involved. The issue isn't whether Trump is forbidden from building a ballroom, it's about his priorities. If Americans are being asked to deal with higher costs, massive debt, and the financial burden of war, they have every right to question a president who seems thrilled to showcase luxury construction projects. That's it for today, guys. What do you think about Trump's vanity projects? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like the video if you made it this far. Subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.